Our first presenter is going to be Michel Pelletier, who is a local resident. He is representing the Canadian Bankers Association, and he's going to be talking about how to recognize fraud, what the bank can do for us, and how changes that the banks perhaps are making right now because there's been some issues that have come up. So a little bit about Michel. His professional experience: he's a senior executive who's been involved in planning, marketing, general management, information technology, primarily in financial services, had a major role in several acquisitions and mergers, also held senior positions in the telecommunications and transportation business. He was an ombudsman for the Laurentian Bank, acting as a facilitator and mediator to resolve client disputes. Formerly a co-chief operating officer for the B2B Trust and executive vice president of Laurentian Bank for agency banking, insurance, and Visa. Chairman of the IT Users Group and member of the Credit Committee. He played a leading role at Laurentian Bank for the integration of North America Trust and an acquisition for Sun Life Trust, leading to the creation of the B2B Trust, named 2002 Financial Institution of the Year at the Quebec Finance Grand Prix Awards. Wow. He's going to come back this afternoon, so I may keep some of it to reintroduce him. Managing Director of Quebecor, subsidiary Videotron Telecom, to successfully launch Internet Protocol home telephony, facilitated mergers with Cable Facilite, Videotron Limité, following the integration of their respective fiber optic and coaxial cable networks. Member of task force charged with combining Laurentian Financial and Desjardins Life Insurance. Subsequently appointed Senior Vice President, Quebec Individual Network for newly created Desjardins Laurentian Life Group. While at Laurentian Financial, held the following positions: President and CEO, Laurentian Imperial President, Placement La Laurentien, a Senior Vice President, Marketing, Laurentian Life. Board member at Placements La Laurentien, Laurentian Life of Canada, and Life of Boston. Vice President of Quebec Operations for Voyageur Entreprise, CSL Group, Intercity Bus Subsidiary. And he's born in Ottawa. He resides in Beaconfield with his wife, Nicole. They have 3 sons and 4 grandchildren, and his interests are mobile technology and financial modeling. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Michel to come up and make his presentation.
Thank you, Ruth. I think the introduction is longer than my text here. Well, good morning, everyone. Well, the Canadian Banking Association, in case you're unfamiliar with it, regroups all the banks in Canada. The big banks are Schedule 1. They're Canadian-based banks, and they are Canadian. Those who are from the U.S. or elsewhere, Europe, that's Schedule 2. So in total, we got roughly maybe 100 banks overall. Now, an ombudsman. What's an ombudsman? It's really, I don't want to ask everyone here, but it's essentially a mediator. It comes from the term imbuds from Sweden, and it's essentially all banks are required to have an ombudsman, and they're to act as a mediator between the client and the bank. Because clearly, I mean, everybody's had a problem with a bank at some point in time. And if you feel you're not getting treated properly, you can address yourself to the bank's ombudsman. And there's also Canadian ombudsman. So should that not work, you go to one level above that, and ultimately the whole idea is to avoid going to court. I've had over 300 complaints that came to my desk, and only 4 of them went to a court, and 2 of them were the cases that involved several other. They were class action suits that involved several other institutions. So quite frankly, the ombudsman can save you an awful lot of time and trouble. Okay, now today, this morning, I'll be talking about fraud. Fraud is, as you're probably aware, targets your money, your bank accounts, credit cards, investment accounts, It's almost like electronic pickpocketing. However, it's more dangerous than that. People are after your personal information, like your account, your personal information number, your passport number. In Canada, it's about a third of the people who have been hit by this, and almost just about half the people know that this exists. And this are statistics that came from 2013, so you can be pretty sure that this is not going down. Credit card losses back then in 2013 were almost $500 million. So 6 years later, we can, and this is the last numbers that we got from the Canadian Bankers Association, we can assume that it's much higher now. We've all heard stories about accounts being hacked. Desjardins just announced 3 days ago, that 4.2 million of their accounts have been hacked. Now, in cases like that, they obviously it's very embarrassing for them, but they do take steps to protect their clients. And what they do is they allow you to sign up for Equifax. Equifax and TransUnions are credit associations which keep a record of how good you are in paying your bills and so on. And they will track also if anybody's trying to get into your account or how many times you've made a request to get your credit score, for instance. So Desjardins essentially is paying for this service on your behalf. You can buy it yourself. Most people don't. They just want to make sure the credit score is good. Now, if it's bad, the next time you apply for a loan, you'll be refused. And so it's very important that you keep your credit score good so you pay your bills on time. Now, it also helps if you have some loans or you have a credit margin. The higher it is, the better. Just don't take it all the way up to the top. Just keep it at a small proportion, and that will improve your credit score quite a bit. Now, phishing and vishing. I guess you've all heard about phishing. So these are essentially scammers that send you emails. They try to rein you into doing something you probably wouldn't do otherwise, and they want to get your personal information, obviously. They send you to websites. Back, say, 10 years ago, those websites looked very, very amateurish. They didn't have the proper logo. They weren't using the proper typeface. There were spelling mistakes. That's not the case anymore. You can hardly tell. You really have to know the difference between, and it's quite minor if you even see it. But let it be known that banks will not ask you to give them personal information either over the phone or through a website. So this is one of the reasons why when you get a new credit card or new checks, they send this in the mail. Well, checks obviously, and credit cards, you don't even need to have a credit card, just need a number. But when they change the card, they send this in the mail. They will not give this kind of information over the phone. Nowhere will they say the Revenue Canada Revenue Agency or Quebec, Revenue Quebec, they will not ask you for personal information. They will send you something by writing. They will give you a number where you can call. You will be required to identify yourself. They will identify themselves too if you ask. They'll have their name, their personal number. And phishing now, what is that? That's the same thing as phishing, except it's voice phishing. So that's when you get a telephone call. And typically, essentially, they want to respond. They're looking for your passwords or your PIN number, and they're going to try and make it like urgent. You know, we have something here. The last one I heard was like, and at the time of the income tax reports are due, you get a lot of times you'll see Revenue Canada calling and saying, look, there's something wrong here. Unless you pay us the $3,000 or $4,000, we're going to go after you. Well, that's total fake. They would never do that over the phone. But everybody gets a little bit nervous when they hear it's Revenue Canada. And they do catch people that way. Scams, there are a number of different types of scams. Romance was the highest one back in 2013, and it looked like it was on the rise. So that's when someone gets close to another person. They try and get their confidence. And before you know it, they're into their bank accounts, and they're into borrowing stuff. So that's, you have to watch for that. Grandparents, grandchildren will ask for money, and that you transfer through Western Union. It's an emergency case, a car accident, they're stuck in a foreign country, and they insist that it's urgent. Many times the grandparents don't necessarily hear correctly, or they may not remember they have this grandson, so they will get caught, and they will transfer money via Western Union, and that's the last they'll ever hear of it. In fact, there's one case, now I'll give you a few real cases. The names are withheld. A widower who had a grandson in Thailand who called and said his wallet and his passport was stolen. He was too embarrassed to tell his parents, therefore he called his grandfather. Please send me money, I need to get out of here, and I need to get a new passport and an air ticket home. After he sent the money, he realized he didn't have a grandson that ever went to Thailand. So you can be sure that that money was lost. A senior receives an urgent email to update his account information and password. That's very typical. So guess what? The day after, his account's been emptied. So, I mean, you really have to be careful when people ask you anything over the phone, even by email. Double check if it's a relative, and so you can avoid that. Here's one that was interesting as well. I hadn't seen this before. There's a retired couple looking to buy a trailer so they could do their dream trip of crossing Canada. And they found a great deal on Craigslist. A guy in Ohio, he was ready to offer a very super low price, just pay for half of his trip and he'll bring the trailer up to Canada. So the couple said, wow, this is great. Sent him the $2,000, never heard from him since. So, I mean, that's so much for the trip. And this one I thought was particularly clever. There was an actress in Toronto who got a part. It required 6 months of her time to go to Hollywood to get filmed. She had a condo, so she figured, well, I'm going to be gone for 6 months. Why don't I rent it out? So she put an ad in the paper, and a nice couple, well-dressed, came to meet her. She was impressed, and he said, well, we really want this. We don't want to see this go. We're willing to write you the 6 months payment right now for a check for that. And sure enough, she said, okay, fine. She took the money, and it was in an account. Not sure it was a legit account, but she took the money, and when she came back, she found out that her condo had been sold. They had taken her mail, signed, forged her signature, changed the mortgage documents so they could be passed over, and they sold it to strangers and got paid $300,000 for it. Now, that was under police investigation, so I don't know whether they did manage to find the people. But when they find the people, it's another thing to try and find the money as well. We've seen lots of scams coming in a minute, and where the money has been gone. You can ask yourself 5 questions. Is someone asking personal or financial information over the phone, email, or text? So if that is, that's a warning sign right there. Requesting your PIN or password, as I've indicated before, everybody would know not to do that. Checks a new credit card not received in the mail. There's also, give me the full payment up front. There's plenty of cases where that has resulted in, yeah, they get paid, they do part of the job, and then they're gone. Pressure to act now. I had a problem with my chimney. It was starting to fall apart. The guy says, we're in the neighborhood. This is like 30 years ago. The guy's in the neighborhood. He says, we've got a crew. We'll put this. They did the job, but it was an absolutely terrible job. And they didn't give it for free. Now, the next thing, I hope you were able to get a pamphlet here up front. In it, there's 9 steps to prevent fraud and scams. So they're inside here, and if you don't have one, there'll be some on the out. There should be plenty available on the table. So the first one, to prevent being a victim, protect personal and financial information. That should be normal. But again, when you're under duress, because of some of the examples I've given before, it's not obvious. Destroy all your financial documents before putting them in recycling. That's one of the major ways of hacking into accounts. And even in companies, they do the same thing. They throw the paper. They don't always go put it through a shredder. Goes in the garbage. People check the garbage. And even cleaning staff, I've heard of this. They go around and empty the baskets, the waste baskets in companies that they're cleaning, and they get all kinds of information, and they sell it. They sell it to foreign countries. Russians, in particular, are very apt at buying this information. Never give personal, we talked about this, never give personal or financial information over the phone unless you initiated the call and you know exactly who you're calling. Report your lost or stolen credit cards or debit cards as soon as you can. Most banks will put a limit as to they will cover you for anything that, as long as you don't wait an inordinate amount of time. Consult with a trusted, knowledgeable financial advisor. I've got a couple of cases later on where we talk about abuse this afternoon, that you shouldn't have trusted that person. Review your financial statements monthly. Most people I know don't look at the credit cards statements. For instance, now they come online if you bother, or you have to go ask for them online. It's not immediately obvious. I have to say my wife never checks her credit card. I do. It's just afterwards. But I had a case where one of my managers, he was out to a conference out in northern Ontario. Meanwhile, somebody was on Rodeo Drive in Los Angeles, racked up $6,000 worth of jewelry. So he had proof that he had to gas up his car in Ontario. So clearly that wasn't. He was a bit nervous at the beginning, but he didn't have to pay for that. But it just goes to show you it can travel very fast. And in some cases, in fact, I think in a lot of cases, when they sell a list of clients with personal information, whether a credit card or something else, they're sold to a group. They'll let it sit there for 6 months, and then they'll take advantage of it, and then it's very hard to trace that afterwards. Well, where did this come from? What did you do? Well, they don't remember what they did 6 months ago and what it was a problem, or if they probably weren't even aware there was a problem. So it's important to shred the information, any documents you have. Never share your PIN number or passwords. And also, it's good to change your passwords. In fact, there are certain software programs out there that will keep track of your passwords. Now, I happen to have a spreadsheet. It's printed out. I store it on one computer only, and if I go somewhere, because I have 100 of them, I have on a lot of websites, and but do not take that lightly, and do not use the same ones. You'd be surprised how many use, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's one of the most popular ones. Or password. The word password is also used. So you have to use something a little more imaginative than that. In fact, many sites now require you to use a mixture of capital letters, minor letters, number signs, or other signs, plus some numbers. So the trouble with those sometimes is hard to remember, especially if you have a few websites and there are different criteria in terms of what they want to see in a password. That's why you have to figure out a way how to keep them, but keep them away from others. Now, if something does happen, you can report to your credit agencies. I think you want them to know right fast, because you don't want to have your credit number, credit value diminish. Equifax and TransUnions are the two here in Canada. And when you hear about the banks, if they get hacked, or any of the major companies get hacked, they quickly will offer you 2 years free Equifax, so you can keep track of your credit score. And if there's anything untowards happening, then you can find out. If you were to Google Phone Busters Canada, there's a whole pile that will come up. There's the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre, and they have contacts in all provinces. So Phone Busters I thought was very easy, because there's all kinds of people that you can call, and they tell you where to go. First, obviously, your financial institution is one you should talk to immediately if you feel that someone's been messing around with your information or your accounts. Now, talked about scams earlier on. There's some real well-known scams. Earl Jones, if you remember that name, in the West Island, back in the early 2000s, he scammed over 51 million from his accounts, his clients. He went to jail for this, and he was released after 4 years. What was interesting is that he was an investment advisor, and he used what's known as a Ponzi scheme. A Ponzi scheme is when you take a client's money and you promise him a great return, maybe like 10%, or today 6% would be interest rates. What they are, 6% would be very good. You'd be hard pressed to get that. But at 10%, it's hard to resist. And he says, well, look, talk to Mr. So-and-so. He's already got his dividend checks or his interest payments. So how does that work? It works that because he's building up his clientele, he uses the money from the next client to pay the first client. And like it's a pyramid, so it goes like this. So he gets, for every one client, he looks to get 2 clients to help finance the one downstairs. And before you know it, this can really balloon. Now, another one, Lino Medio from Mount Royal, this was a bit later on, he absconded 130 million from 1,300 victims. Now he has to go to jail for 5 years, and Earl Jones got out after 4. So we're not that rigorous here compared to the next one. The next one is Bernie Madoff. I'm sure you've all heard of Bernie Madoff. He made off with $65 billion. And all his clients were wealthy. He was chairman of NASDAQ, one of the major brokerage and stock market exchanges in the States after the New York Stock Exchange. So he was everywhere. He was a social butterfly, if you like, and knew all the big wigs. They all gave him millions, in some cases over 100 million. Same thing, Ponzi scheme. Made such a reputation that everybody was begging to take their money. At one point, he says, no, I'm not taking any more clients. He said, well, you've got it here. I'll give you an extra 100 million. And so at the end of the day, he did get caught. He won't be out until 2139. He'll be over 200 years old, so essentially he's there for the rest of his years. Now, on this, I don't know if you've heard of this movie called Wizard of Lies. It's all about Bernie Madoff and his family and so on, and how he did this. Now, so I happened to look and make a little search. It's playing on HBO this Sunday, for those of you who get it, at 6:40, so November 10th. It stars Robert De Niro and Michel Pfeiffer. I've seen it, and it's a very interesting film. Essentially a real-life film in terms of how this guy did it. So the moral in these kinds of scams, if it's too good to be true, it usually is. Don't take it. Don't fall for it. I'm ready for questions.
How do you increase your credit margin? And what is a credit margin?
Okay. A credit margin is essentially how much you're able to get from a financial institution. So each one has their, like for instance, if you want a typical one is a credit card. You apply for a credit card, essentially you'll get nothing less than $1,000. However, if you've not paid your bills before and your credit rating is very low, they can refuse you. So the trick to getting a good credit rating is to pay your bills on time. And when you do get credit, take it a bit higher than you think you're going to spend. In other words, never spend more than half of your credit card. They'll start looking at it. And if you spend only, say, a third or less, and you do this on a regular basis, the next time you say, well, I'm going to have to increase it because I don't want to burst it. You can call, and they will augment your credit rating or credit availability. In other words, if you're at $3,000 for a credit card, and you pay it all the time, and you say, well, look, I have a few things, I want to bring it up to 5, or in many cases, 30,000 or more. The trick is to pay your bills on time. When you don't, then they keep track, especially if you're over 90 days, that will affect your credit rating. Now, it doesn't mean you won't have any credit. It just means that they'll watch you and they may limit you. And the other thing too is that the more credit cards you have, that can impede because they start looking, well, what is he doing? You don't want to so use one credit card to pay off another credit card. That's illegal. So just do it properly and on time, and your credit score will be good. Credit score, they go up to about, it's 900, so from 0 to 900. So very few people get 900, but you want to try and keep it over 750. And people, in many cases, you can't get a bank loan if you're below 640. So, and you can get your credit card number by calling Equifax or TransUnion. And in some cases, they will give it to you, but for a fee immediately, or they will mail it to you. You don't get it online.
Okay, in order to get through, what responsibility does Desjardins have for all of its clients following last week's news that all members' information had been copied or hacked, I guess?
Well, I don't know what they're going to do ultimately. The first thing they will do is they will provide you with Equifax to make sure you can follow, because if you're hacked or their accounts are hacked, doesn't mean that you're going to suffer, because they're going to be looking for that. Now, this happened because it's an employee. It was an inside job, in other words, so they weren't hacked from the outside. And they don't know at this point who is being hurt and how much is involved. So they just know the names have gone and that the account numbers are known, and that, but they're certainly taking precautions to make sure that, probably using algorithms to make sure that there's no undue transactions in people's accounts. Like, for instance, if you don't spend more than a couple of thousand on your credit card in a month, and they're finding out people are trying to go to the max, that will trigger something immediately on Desjardins systems. So there's no doubt this is very embarrassing for them. Now, TJ Maxx had way more in the States, a well-known retailer. They had a lot more than that. And in some cases, we're talking hundreds of millions of credit card numbers and accounts. Not so much, we don't see those kind of numbers here, but in the States you do. So that doesn't mean that people have suffered from any illegal transactions. But it is embarrassing to say that, especially for a bank, to lose credibility and lose the fact that they don't have complete grasp on the credit on the accounts. But again, this was an inside job. Many of them are inside jobs. Many of them are, but you don't necessarily know where the information, who got it. In this case, they found the employee. Employee is fired, and probably take legal action against that person.
We have another 4. How do you find a good, honest person to handle your portfolio? Is there an association to check and verify financial advisors?
Yes. Well, yes. Here in Quebec, they have to be registered with l'Autorité des marchés financiers, the AMF. And if they're not, don't deal with them. Also, the major financial institutions are reputed. You can also do some searching on the web or talk to your friends and family. This is a good way to find out if people that you know are very happy with the service they're getting, and they have trust in the advisor. That's probably a good way, as opposed to just picking one out of the blue. So, and they should belong to a financial institution that you know, and so you can have confidence. So the big financial institutions, all the banks, all the insurance companies, they do have advisors. There's some companies that specialize only in that area as advisors. And mutual fund companies, the same thing. So it's, but one thing you want to check is make sure they're registered. And if you meet someone, you want to see their card, their accreditations on their business card, and you want to check up on them.
I think everybody here in the room probably has. I certainly have. We receive phone calls. There's something wrong with your Windows program. What about also opening an email on your phone? Because I get my emails on my phone. Is there a danger in this? How can we educate or inform people to be very careful what they're opening and what should they open and what can they do about it? Because it's never ending.
Right. Well, if it's from someone you don't know, or someone you don't trust. If you don't know them, you're not necessarily going to trust them. Don't open them.
But I can tell you that on Facebook, you'll get a message from somebody who is your friend, and you'll open it, and they didn't send it. You're hacked.
Yeah. Well, that is a problem. Now, I guess you can always close your Facebook account. But the thing is, Facebook is not noted for doing a lot of screening. And right now, they're before the Congress in the U.S. because they're not going to stop political type of postings. Twitter will. They've just announced, Twitter said no more ads for any political whatsoever, particularly with the states going on and all the fakes, the election coming up in November next year. So Twitter said no more news on politics. If you're trying to promote someone, we won't allow it to go through. In Facebook's case, they're saying it's all about freedom of speech, even though there's a ton of fake news and it's very degrading to derogatory against many people, as we know. So, but as far as opening, especially if they say if it's urgent, you got to go here for like Windows, do this tonight or you won't be getting into your I wouldn't do it. I definitely wouldn't do it. Anytime there's any sense of urgency, somebody says it's urgent, you got to do it because tomorrow you're not going to get into yours. Forget that.
Yeah.
And even then, there are ways to be able to track the name of because many cases just says Microsoft Windows or something similar. But if you can look into the name, you can actually dig into it. For those who are a little bit more adept at the programming side, they can see if it actually comes from that company or not.
You have to be very careful too, because the logos that they use are almost really real. They're very hard to realize that they're not the bank institution's logo or whatever.
Well, I've seen banks go from total amateurish things to extremely professional ones.
Well, another question here. Calls from Congo, etc., ring once in the middle of the night and then they hang up. I don't quite know what they're asking me. I also get throughout the day, all hours of the day, morning, calls where they're talking Chinese or Japanese or something. And I almost at the point of wondering if they're casing my joint to see if I'm at home.
Well, there is that. That's a good point. If you're home, then they probably won't bother you. But they're also, and I'm not sure how they do this, but they do pick up information by you just lifting up the phone, even if you don't say anything. They know where you are, and they know, I don't know what it amounts to, but there's, as you say, there's a lot of foreign language ones that do this.
I guess I have to invest in caller ID on my landline, but now they are even calling me on my cell phone. But on my iPhone, I see a number, so I don't answer.
Yeah, and then in many cases, you can block these phones. Once they come in, and phone numbers, once you see that, and you say, I don't want to do this anymore, there are many phones that allow you to block it.
Well, I may be like a lot of seniors. I'm not very techie, so I don't know how to do it. So that's another problem. That's why we're real candidates.
Call your nephew.
My grandsons.
That's
yes.
right.
Last one. Should we approach our bank for a free Equifax so we can remember when it started?
Well, if you're normally the banks will pay if there was a case of hacking. And like, for instance, the Desjardins case, they will pay for 2 years. And most in the US, they will pay for at least a year. So it's not a big fee. There's different grades, but I think it's roughly $25 a year. So it's not a big fee for, and what that does is it gets you get track of your history, your transactions, and of course your credit score. So that would be, it's advisable to check now and again. Now I know there's one bank in particular, it's a Bank of Nova Scotia, where they will allow you, they've done a deal with TransUnion, which is the other credit rating company, and then you can check anytime what your credit is. They'll update it every month.
Well, let's all give Michel a great hand. Thank you very much, Michel.
Thank you, Ruth.